All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I think this is the first installment of the Population and Health Area of Interest departmental seminar. And we're really delighted to be able to actually host Brian Thiede here. But before I mention his fascinating background, let me just also first acknowledge Hopkins Population Center and Fei Nian Chen, who's the director, for co-sponsoring the event, and also Lanier Zimmerman here, who has really done all the job for organizing the event. So I'm just a talking head here. Let me then go to introduce Brian. He is an associate professor of rural sociology, sociology and demography, director of graduate studies in rural sociology, and associate director of Population Research Institute at Penn State University. He received his PhD and MS from Cornell and his BA from Bucknell University. His research program focuses on two substantive areas. The first one is he examines the relationship between climate change, demographic and health outcomes, and economic development, primarily in low and middle income countries. He currently has two NIH-funded projects. I hope this is still up to date in this area. The first one measures the compounding effects of armed conflict and climate shocks on maternal and child health. And the second one, and this is specifically in the context of sub-Saharan Africa. The second project measures and compares the effects of weather shocks during childhood through early adulthood on health outcomes in mid-adulthood. So very much the lifespan lens that we are great at, or we're very interested in. This project uses panel data from Indonesia and Mexico, so very wide geographic reach. His second area of research focuses on poverty and inequality in the United States, actually. And current projects examine income inequality in the rural US and the relationship between natural resource development and economic outcomes. Please join me in welcoming Brian.
Hey, good afternoon. Yeah, thanks for coming out this, I guess it's mid-December now, afternoon. Really appreciate the invitation to share some of my research. And before I get started, I do just want to say, please feel free to interrupt with any questions throughout the presentation. This is a nice touchscreen. So to give you a sense, I want to start by giving a sense of where I'm going to try to go in this talk. The main goals here are to discuss the impacts of climate variability on population dynamics and health. I'll focus on some papers that look at undernutrition, fertility, and migration around the world. And these are all from a kind of broader program of research that some of my colleagues and I have been working on that uses what we're calling big microdata to examine these questions about population and environment interactions. I'll try to end by kind of discussing some of the limitations to this work, which will hopefully give us some ideas for thinking about how we can innovate in this area of research. And like I said, hopefully we're spurring some discussion. Again, please feel free to interrupt throughout. And then to give you a sense of kind of some of the key points, in case you want to leave or sign off now, I'm going to argue that climate variability is having large and multidimensional impacts on different demographic processes, but these impacts don't always align with some of the most popular and common narratives that we might see in the media and among policymakers. We'll also try to argue that these so-called big microdata are a really powerful tool for studying these population-environment interactions, for identifying environmental effects on these outcomes of interest, but they also require complementary approaches to try to understand mechanisms and think about the solutions to try to mitigate some of the impacts that we're detecting. And then finally, I would say overall in the population environment literature and the work on climate change, I think we know a lot more than we did just a decade ago, but there are still really significant gaps, and I think we need some kind of paradigms both in research, but also thinking about training to try to advance the field. So with this outline of the talk in mind, I want to start by making kind of three broader points about the general motivation for my research program on population dynamics and climate change. So the first is that climate change and human-caused climate change is unfolding and is already leading to dangerous conditions, and it appears quite unlikely to slow or stop before conditions get worse. So 2024 was classified as the warmest on record according to multiple data sets. And the top 10 hottest years on record are all now from the last 10 years, right? And the apparent acceleration of warming that you can see on the bottom panel there, suggests that the records are unlikely to continue being broken in the years ahead. So then second, there's a growing body of scientific evidence about the demographic and health impacts of changing temperatures and precipitation patterns. As I said before, I think this evidence is really dramatically better if we look at the research that's coming out over the last 5 or so years than it was a decade or two ago. And it's increasingly gaining attention of the public and policymakers, as you can see in some of these news media articles and other government reports. So in other words, I think there's significant demand for evidence about climate impacts on population health across many sectors. And then thirdly, I think the findings from academic research in the field are increasingly rigorous, often more nuanced, as I'll try to show, than we might see in the popular media, but there are really important questions that remain unanswered. Some of these are due to data constraints. Some of them are due to a lack of interdisciplinary collaboration. And then I think in some cases, these limitations are also just due to a lack of imagination. So with that in mind, I'll try to zoom into 3 findings from some of my own research or ongoing research, and noting many excellent collaborators on these projects. These are not solo authored work. And I've tried to I've decided to kind of focus on 3 different papers to kind of give you a sense of the breadth of this field, obviously at the expense of some depth. So again, please feel free to interrupt with clarifying questions, and I've also tried to provide links to any working papers in case you're interested. So the first paper that I want to highlight examines the link between climate variability and children's health globally. The kind of headline finding from this paper is that heat stress increases acute childhood malnutrition, but is sometimes and unexpectedly associated with improved indicators of chronic malnutrition. And there's maybe a question mark around the last finding, which I'll get to in a second. So with that finding in mind, I want to step back and tell you what we did. So for this study, what we did was we extracted data on children's weight for height, height for age, and survival from all of the geocoded demographic and health surveys that were fielded globally. We focused on the years 1990 to 2016. In other words, we cut off at 2016 because of the climate data that we're using, which ended at 2016, although the findings are robust to going beyond that using an additional climate data source. But this gives us 137 surveys. And so what we did is we modeled weight for height among children ages 0 to 23 months. We had a little over 360,000 observations for that analysis. Then we looked at height for age, Z-scores among children who were aged 24 to 59 months. We had over 500,000 observations there. And then we did an additional kind of parallel analysis looking at child mortality for 1-year increments. So basically, if a child was alive at age 1, we'd look at mortality. Did they die between age 1 and 2? And we did that for all 1-year increments from 0 to 59 months. So we linked these observations to temperature and precipitation records from one of multiple climate data sets that are available. We use this so-called CHIRPS and CHIRTS data set because it's very high resolution and we feel one of the more accurate products out there. And then we linked these climate measures from CHIRPS and CHIRTS to the children in our analytic samples, and we constructed different measures of exposures to temperature and precipitation. In all these cases, we're measuring temperature and precipitation as anomalies, which you can think of as Z-scores relative to the village or neighborhood specific average. So in other words, for each location, for each of these dots in our data, we merged the climate data to those locations. We calculated the long-term average of temperature and precipitation, let's say for every 12-month period from 1983 until 2016, right? We have that long-term average. And then we looked at a different exposure period. So for example, when we're measuring weight for height Z-scores, we look at the 12 months prior to when that weight for height Z-score was measured, right? And we take the temperature or precipitation during that exposure period. We subtract out the long-term mean and divide that by the long-term standard deviation to give a sense of, again, basically just a Z-score of how far from the local average temperature or precipitation were during that exposure period. So it's a nice relative measure. Let's see, anything here? It's a nice relative measure. There are multiple approaches to measuring temperature and precipitation exposures, which I could get into in any Q&A. But it's really nice. It provides a kind of a comparable measure of deviation from local conditions that we feel is appropriate for this type of global analysis. So while this is getting up, oh, great. So again, for weight for height, we're looking at the 12 months right prior to the interview, right? Because this is an indicator of acute malnutrition that we think is sensitive to recent conditions. And we're looking at 0 to 23-month-old children. For height for age, more of an indicator of chronic exposures, chronic insults. Again, we're looking at children who are 2 to 5 for that outcome. And we're measuring that outcome as a function of early life climatic conditions. So from the prenatal year up until age 2 for all those children. And then for mortality, I say it's variable. Basically, our analyses of mortality are trying to understand what's going on, or these are kind of supplementary analyses to understand what's going on with weight for height, and height for age, which I'll explain in a minute. So we try to match them onto our analyses of weight for height and height for age as much as possible. So for looking at mortality among 0 to 11-month and 12 to 23-month-olds, we're using the same approach that we did for weight for height, because that's the same age range as that analysis. And then for height for age, for mortality among 2 to 5-year-olds, we're looking at mortality as a function of those early life exposures. Again, this is because we're modeling mortality to try to understand if there's a mortality-related bias in our estimates of height for age and weight for height, which I'll get to, and will hopefully make a little more sense in a second. And so with these linked data sets, we're then fitting linear and logistic regression models as a function of those temperature and precipitation exposures that I just described, net of a set of household and individual level controls, and province fixed effects, and a world region specific linear time trend to try to account for some of the just secular changes in climate and development across each world region. Okay, great. So our first models focus on children's weight, again, more of an indicator of acute malnutrition. And we found that heat was associated with lower weight when measured across this entire global sample, which you can see here, and across many of the world regions that we look at within region stratified analyses. To give you a sense of these associations, the results from the global sample would indicate that each standard deviation increase in temperature, again, in that 12 months prior to the interview, would be associated with about a 0.022 standard deviation reduction in weight for height. This corresponds to about a 5.4% change from the average weight for height across the sample. And again, this is a 1 standard deviation increase in temperature. In the context that we're looking at, we see temperature anomalies of +2 or +3 that are relatively common given warming that's going on. So we could see up to kind of 15% changes in the average weight for height, across our sample, which we view as kind of substantively meaningful. And I'd say the findings with weight for height, heat undermining weight for height, very consistent across a lot of different studies that are, country or region specific and using other data sets. So that's very, we're confirming a lot of prior results there. And then our second models are focused on children's height, again, more of an indicator of chronic malnutrition, chronic health insults. And we found that both overall and in several individual regions, heat was associated with increase in heights, which would kind of suggest improvements in health conditions. This finding, we would say, is pretty unexpected, given that heat in particular is pretty much almost always associated with worse health and economic, and to some extent, agricultural outcomes. But this finding is really robust to a lot of different modeling approaches and measurement approaches that we employed. And it's also consistent with a lot of other kind of preliminary results that we've seen presented at conferences from other authors. So I think there's been a lot of questions of what's going on here in terms of why would heat be associated with improvements in height? There are several, I think, plausible substantive explanations, which we could maybe get into later. But we mainly wanted to assess whether this result could reflect some type of selective mortality and survival. So whether the healthiest and tallest children were more likely to survive these same heat shocks. And so that's why, to explore this, we fit some additional models of child mortality, again, for each 1-year age group in our data. So we're using a sample of any child that was alive at the beginning of one of these age intervals. The model is indicating if the child died or not. And we found that heat indeed increased mortality risk at each age, and these impacts appeared, at least in terms of our point estimates, kind of relatively strongest among the older age groups for which we were modeling height for age. And so in our view, these findings provide at least kind of suggestive, but we think reasonable evidence that heat-related mortality could bias estimates of heat effects on nutrition, where the least healthy children may not survive to be observed in the data when their heights are being measured. Our analyses are obviously, these are just kind of parallel models. We're not able to kind of track the same children. And so there's a lot of open questions here, but we think that, this finding suggests the need to kind of explore this potential, selection effect a little bit more in this literature. So overall, why does this type of research matter? We think our findings, emphasize that continued warming will increase the burden of acute malnutrition and the many other correlated health outcomes that come with it across many regions of the world. We know that, and as many of you here know, the long-term impacts of these nutritional insults during childhood are costly. So any interventions that can be designed to help mitigate them can have potentially long-term impacts, high returns on investment. And that's obviously in addition to the very, immediate ethical benefits of dealing with these impacts that we're observing. We think that the possible mortality-related biases that we're seeing in terms of the estimated association between heat and height for age, potentially underline the importance of thinking about selection. But more broadly, we think that they really emphasize the potential linkages between demographic processes, right? These population level health indicators are not independent of mortality, migration, and fertility. We often model these outcomes individually, but they're all interrelated, and we should think a little bit more about how then, climate impacts on one of these outcomes could have second-order impacts on the other. And then lastly, thinking about combining just as a general principle, being open to unexpected results. Think about why we might actually observe heat improving height, right? And there are some plausible reasons, like, for example, warming up to a certain level can actually increase agricultural yields until the warming gets to a certain threshold. So there could actually be some marginal incremental benefits of the warming that we've seen, right? But we should also think critically in terms of the potential biases that could actually, and the data artifacts that could explain some of these very puzzling results. Great. Okay. So that's one of our, that's an example where we're looking at child health outcomes. I'm now going to move to an analysis, taking a somewhat similar approach, but looking at fertility and focus on a specific country. So here, our main finding is that climate-related flooding is associated with changes in fertility, but with very large variation in the direction and the magnitude of these effects. So here, we started this study. This is looking at fertility and flooding in Bangladesh. And we started this study by developing an annual record of childbearing among reproductive age women in Bangladesh using the birth records from the DHS. And so we were able to use geocoded samples from 2004, 2007, and you can see basically through 2017 and 18. We excluded the most recent round because of limitations to some of our flooding data. Right. And this gives us an analytic sample of about 600,000 person years covering the years 2003 to 2018. And again, we're looking at this particular window given some constraints on the Earth observation data that we're using to measure flooding. We then constructed monsoon season flood exposures that were derived from this Earth observation data. We're basically taking a map, an observation, an image that looks like the top panel, and then turning it into a meaningful measure of flood exposure. And so basically what we did is that for each calendar year, we calculated the maximum percentage of land that was inundated during the monsoon season, which we're kind of broadly defining as July through December, within a 10-kilometer radius of each village or neighborhood. So again, for each location, we're basically looking at the July to December period we're looking at all the images in terms of from the Earth observation satellite, and we're able to identify inundated land and non-inundated land. And so for that period, we find the maximum area exposed within a 10-kilometer radius of each location, right? We subtract out any inundation during the dry season, which we assume is standing water, and we take that difference as basically the maximum extent of flooding during a given calendar year monsoon season. And there are a lot of different approaches to measuring flooding. You all may have some ideas that might capture like the intensity of flooding, the depth of flooding. But as a first step, we thought that this was a pretty good way to capture flood exposure fairly broadly defined. And then what we did is we fit discrete time event history models looking at fertility in a given year as a function of flood exposures in the previous 2 years, right? And again, we're controlling for a variety of individual and household level characteristics. Also controlling for historical flooding and soil salinity, which is relevant in this context, and then controlling for year and district fixed effects. So we found here that flood exposures overall are not associated with fertility when we model this across the entire sample. Again, this is a null finding that's really robust to a wide range of modeling and measuring approaches, including doing things like measuring flooding using the median level of inundation, looking at cumulative flood exposure during the monsoon season, and looking at kind of like discrete categories of flood extent. Okay. However, we did find that fertility among some of the subpopulations in the country was affected by flooding. And in all cases, this operated with a 2-year lag. So it's that T-2 variable that seems to matter the most, right? And so we see increases in fertility among women with less than a primary school education. And is there anything that I can do? And to give you a sense of the magnitude of effects, flood exposures where there'd be about 30% of that area inundated, which would be relatively common in our data, would be associated with an approximately 6.2% increase in the odds of childbearing among less educated women in our sample. We find differences in effects by parity. So as one example, we see declines in fertility associated with flooding among women who had no children ever born to start, but increases among women who had 2 or more children ever born, and that the magnitude of those impacts increases with parity. And then finally, we found that flood-related declines in fertility were concentrated in urban versus rural areas. And then we also conducted parallel analyses of the associations between flooding and both entry into first marriage and child mortality to examine 2 of the possible mechanisms that could explain any of these observed effects. Entry into marriage being important given the context of childbearing in the country, and child mortality potentially being important if we think about like insurance or replacement type dynamics. And we found here that flood exposures were associated with delays into entry into marriage among women in urban areas, which is in fact consistent with this flood-related decline in fertility among urban women that we observe. But otherwise, we basically find no effects of flooding on entry into marriage or child mortality among any of the subpopulations. So we think that other dynamics like contraceptive access and things like that could potentially be explaining these results. So why does this matter? We think that the results here underscore potential impacts of climate stressors on reproductive outcomes, at least from the perspective of a demographer, the kind of demography literature. In my view, work on climate and reproductive outcomes has received much less attention than, for example, the huge literature on climate and migration, but is super important and really merits more attention. As I suggested, our results, I think, are quite descriptive and raise a lot of questions about what could explain them, which I think underlies the need for more work that would look at the mechanisms that could be explaining these effects, which ultimately is kind of where any type of intervention, I think, would be targeted. So I've mentioned a few potential mechanisms here, and I think there's a lot more work to be done there. And then finally, I would say our work, I think the attention to flooding in this context is really important, and it underscores the need to think about what environmental stressors are most salient in a given context. So for example, in the previous analysis that I showed you, we're looking at temperature and precipitation anomalies. These are commonly used measures in this literature. They're very general, they're quite generic. In my view, they're quite good for these global analyses. But in the context of Bangladesh, for example, they wouldn't be super helpful, especially, for example, the precipitation anomaly. So like looking at precipitation is a very poor proxy for looking at flooding in Bangladesh. We actually looked at this in our data, and precipitation in terms of the amount of precipitation as it falls is actually weakly and negatively correlated with flooding, right? Because flooding is more a function of topography, hydrology, and kind of upstream precipitation. And so this highlights the need to really, think through and identify the most salient risks in a given context, and not just default to using temperature and precipitation anomalies, as many of us have done in some of our studies in this literature. Okay, and then I think I still have time, so I'm going to try to go through one more finding quickly that will hopefully spur some discussion here. And so the final finding I'd like to highlight is that environmental stressors can sometimes reduce migration, right? And this finding stands in contrast to the kind of common narrative that climate change will displace populations. You may see headlines like 2 billion people to be displaced by climate change, in the next several decades. And there are maybe reasons to think that some of these future impacts could be different than the historical analogs that we're looking at. But in terms of the evidence to date, we do actually find that in some contexts, not all contexts, these environmental stressors can reduce migration. So what we did here was we looked at census and survey microdata using the IPUMS international system, which is great for anyone who hasn't used it. Looking at 6 countries in Asia. Basically, this was a data-driven selection in terms of which countries we focused on. There have been comparable analyses taking this approach, looking at South America and Africa, and this is kind of the third paper in that trilogy of papers looking at climate and migration using the census data. So you can see the 6 countries there. We basically chose countries that had georeferenced information on where people lived at the time of the census and where they lived 5 years prior. And specifically countries that had 2 or more censuses with that information so that we could look at within province and within country variation over time. This gave us a sample of about 55 million individuals. We focused on ages 15 to 49 at the beginning of the migration period, basically looking at working age adults who might be kind of driven by labor or in some cases education-related moves. And these censuses were fielded in between 1985 and 2011. We linked those data to temperature and precipitation records from another data source, the Climatic Research Unit time series, the CREW data, right? The CREW and the CHIRPS and CHIRTS are kind of the 2 data sets that our group has worked the most with. There are several other really good products that I'm glad to refer to if needed. And again, we looked at anomalies here, right? And so this data provided monthly climate records from 1980 to the present, and we were able to use those to construct measures of temperature and precipitation anomalies. And I'll get to kind of the time period in a second. And so what we did here was we fit logistic regression models, basically did someone move or not in the 5 years prior to the census, right? So imagine someone's interviewed at the census. We know where they lived 5 years prior. So we basically took everyone back to where they were 5 years prior to the census. We knew their location, right? We measured the temperature and precipitation in that location over the 5-year migration interval between that point and the census, right? And again, that's an anomaly, so you can think of it as a province-specific z-score of temperature and precipitation. And our model is basically predicting whether or not someone moved from that baseline location to another province at the time of the census. So this is only inter-province migration, and it's only permanent migration in the sense of someone had to move to a different place and stay in that different place at the time of the census. We're going to be missing a lot of short-term temporary moves, which we can discuss as a potential limitation. And again, we're implementing a variety of controls here. So the results overall show that precipitation deficits reduce migration across the sample. According to point estimates, we'd find that a 2 standard deviation reduction in precipitation, which we might consider a rough proxy for drought conditions, would be associated with a 33% reduction in migration odds, again, of inter-province migration. So a pretty meaningful reduction in our view. We also fit country-specific models, and we found a lot of variation in these associations across country, which you might expect given differences in the demographic and the ecological context. So for example, we found that precipitation deficits reduce migration in China, increase migration in Philippines, and were not associated with significantly with migration elsewhere. And then finally, we also examined if these effects varied by age, sex, and educational attainment. And contrary to some expectations of how these climate impacts are distributed, overall across our whole sample, we don't find any variation across these different dimensions, but we do find variation within countries. So for example, we find differences by age and sex in China and Vietnam, where younger adults and women were more sensitive to the effects of precipitation deficits than older adults and men. But none of those differences emerge in any of the other countries, right? So in other words, these differences by age, sex, and education are more context specific than we could get at in that global model. Right? And this is consistent with, I think, a conclusion that vulnerability is really distributed in complex ways. So we think these results are important for at least three reasons. First, and maybe foremost, they complicate the common narratives around displacement and so-called climate refugees, which we argue have received disproportionate attention in the media and policy communities. Again, we're not arguing that those concepts, those populations don't exist, and they may and merit attention, but we think it's important to kind of add that nuance to this debate, especially because populations that are potentially trapped by these climate shocks, right, may in fact be the most vulnerable because they're stuck in these places that are experiencing adverse environmental, potentially economic conditions. And so if we're thinking about all the attention going to those who are displaced, we may be missing these populations who are stuck in place, right? Which is, has parallels to conflict settings, for example, where those who are stuck in place are sometimes extremely vulnerable. These results underscore the complexity of migration decision-making in general, and also, push us to think about individuals' agency, right? Not being passive actors who are just swept away by environmental conditions, but potentially navigating these changes in complex ways. And as I've emphasized, related to my first point, these trapped populations may be extremely vulnerable, and I think merit a lot of attention. Okay, so with these results in mind, I guess I just want to step back and make a few broader points about maybe the state of the field. So as we've seen here, environmental changes can have impacts on multiple demographic and health outcomes. It's mainly just text here, so it's not like a big deal. Okay, great. Yeah, so I mean, as we know, because of kind of necessities associated with our modeling strategies, we often look at these outcomes. We have to model them independently and individually, but in practice, we know many of these outcomes are really not independent. And we should think a little bit more about these second order impacts. So for example, how does climate-induced migration, right, potentially affect health? These are really challenging to model in my view, and maybe it's one of the reasons that people have been reluctant to look at this, but those second order impacts I think are super important and need to be considered more. We also saw a lot of variation in these impacts across different groups defined socially, demographically, geographically. The approaches that we've taken here, this kind of big microdata approach, has major limitations in terms of how we measure vulnerability. Censuses mainly have information on age, sex, and education, which mean a lot of different things in different places and also intersect with a lot of other factors. And so I think we need to think about how we can get at kind of more granular intersectional ways of measuring vulnerability, using other data sources. And then finally, I think we need to think a lot about the time periods that we're measuring these climate exposures and thinking about the ways that these impacts can play out over a lot of different time periods. So thinking about the selection processes that we highlighted in the study of health and mortality, but also thinking about what are the appropriate lags, what are the appropriate exposure periods that we're looking at. These are all highly contested and I think variable across the literature. And I think there's room for more kind of standardization and more kind of systematic attention to those. There's also the big question of what happens moving forward, right? So like, is it appropriate to look at these historical estimates and then project forward? In some ways, that's kind of the best that we can do, right? That's kind of, we're looking at these anomalies of like, to kind of understand responses to these short-term deviations and think about, what would that look like if we see, this a 2 standard deviation increase in average temperatures? What would that look like? That's kind of like, I think, one of the best available approaches, but we need to be cautious about that too, given the presence of different thresholds. For example, as I mentioned, like there's some evidence that, with some warming up to certain points, outcomes like, agricultural yields can actually see improvements. But then once you get past these critical points, you may see really dramatic reduction in those yields. And the same thing's true of certain vector-borne diseases and so forth. So we need to be really aware of those thresholds and be cautious as we project forward. Right? I think in most cases, the projections, like the reality is likely to be worse than what we'd project given those thresholds, but we should be cautious about. And then just a final quick set of ideas for future research. So as I mentioned, I think if we look back 15, 20 years, there was research looking at, there was still a pretty vibrant population and environment literature, but it's improved dramatically since then, especially with the kind of increased integration of a kind of geo-referenced, spatially referenced environmental data with these demographic records that has just allowed for a lot more sophisticated modeling. But there's still, I think, really important gaps and questions that remain. So one idea for future research, I think, is there's just a need for more interdisciplinary collaboration, thinking about how we measure climate risks and also thinking about those mechanisms that could link some of these exposures and the outcomes we're interested in, right? Yeah, we need more and deeper interdisciplinary collaboration, not just among social scientists, but also thinking about collaboration with natural scientists. One example here is that I've got a pretty new project where we're looking at marine heat waves, and this was motivated by some conversation with one of my colleagues and a marine biology colleague, and she was raising questions about marine heat waves. And so what we're doing is we're looking at coastal population nutrition as it relates to marine heat waves, right? Which we think is pretty interesting. But like, I had no idea how to measure marine heat waves, and we could only get at that due to this really nice collaboration with these marine biologists. Second, I think, is attention to interaction between climate variability and other stressors. A lot of us think that climate change is like the most important thing, and it's super important. But for a lot of these populations, there are other pressing demands, armed conflict, chronic poverty, things like that, that also affect many of these health outcomes. And so I think we want to be more open to thinking about how these other stressors affect the same outcomes, how they interact with climate to potentially amplify or have additive effects on the outcomes of interest. As one example, we've got a project looking at conflict and climate and how they interact. And what we found here, and this is just a very preliminary graph, is basically this is showing the effect of any conflict exposure, like a nearby conflict exposure on weight for height. And we find that it interacts with temperature. So these negative impacts are really concentrated when those conflict events occur in heat-stressed environments. And there's a lot more to unpack there. And again, this is very preliminary, but I think highlights the importance of thinking about these interactions between different contextual stressors. Thirdly, thinking about impacts during adolescence and early childhood. We were talking about that this morning. I think that these age groups have basically been ignored in the climate change literature. There's a lot of attention to the under 5 ages, and then especially actually in like the European and US context, attention to older populations and heat exposure. But in my reading of it, at least, there's a huge gap in terms of thinking about basically like the 5 to 17-year-old population, where there are a lot of important health outcomes and important like transition to adulthood, life course transition outcomes that can occur. We know, I think, pretty little about that. Thinking about interventions, right? So we measure all these impacts, but what can we do to actually mitigate and protect populations from these potential climate risks? I think there's a lot of room to think about how we can do that. There's been some growing attention to kind of how cash transfers and other safety net programs can potentially protect against climate shocks. I think a lot of that has been in the kind of economic literature, maybe less so looking at health outcomes, but not exclusively so. Some papers have done that, but I think more work is needed there. And then as a final point, thinking about whether and how we can collect higher frequency data with less biased geographic coverage, right? So this is just showing the location of those DHS clusters from our global study. There are major gaps there in terms of climate vulnerable countries that have no data. And then if we thought about the time dimension too, there'd also be major gaps in terms of populations that were recently affected by major environmental shocks and no data available there. So given the magnitude of these problems, I know it's difficult to imagine in the current funding environment. It does seem like an important investment to try to collect more data so that we can really know what's going on, especially in the most at-risk places. So with that, I would welcome any questions or comments. And thanks for your time. Oh yeah, I can. Yeah, Kaylin, can you unmute yourself?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much. I did a little bit of research in undergrad regarding health system preparedness in terms of climate change. So just looking at the resilience of health systems, and I was wondering your thoughts on future directions in terms of specifically studying health system population and health worker populations, like climate migration and how climate change is impacting those populations specifically.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's one of several things that have paralleled an earlier discussion this morning. So I would say I'm by no means a health systems expert, but I do think that this is an area for significant innovation and attention, and maybe one of those places for that kind of interdisciplinary collaboration. Where people like me who have been focused on migration or kind of some individual health outcomes would really benefit from thinking about that health systems approach, both in terms of like better understanding some of the mechanisms that could explain the impacts that we're seeing, and then also thinking about potential interventions and solutions. So yeah, that's probably an unsatisfactory answer, but it's a great point and something I'd like to think more about.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Yeah. David, online.
Can I jump in?
Yes, please.
Yes, thank you. Very stimulating lecture, broadening my horizons. With regard to the weight length relationships at that younger age, that's a tricky issue because you're dealing with perhaps a truncated population regarding weight to height, which is reduced while height is okay because of low birth weight and increased neonatal mortality during that period. The other thing is that uh, in utero, height is at its peak velocity uh, in mid-pregnancy, whereas weight is at its maximum velocity in the last 10 weeks of the pregnancy, so that you will see with increasing uh, food limitation, you may see some decrement in velocity of weight gain, particularly as the mother is either losing weight or not gaining the appropriate weight. So that's a problem. And towards the end, you mentioned the adolescents, which I thought was very interesting. And I was thinking that if you looked at that population, you may be able to determine whether there's short-term or long-term uh, uh, sequelae as a result of the nutritional insults that may have occurred early on. I'd also say the metabolic rate of that infant is declining very much during the last part of the year and into the second and third year. So thank you for really a stimulating lecture.
Great. Yeah. And thanks for those comments. I've written them down here and are definitely things that we'll consider for sure. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for that's here. I am interested in those places that have both the extremes. They have floods and heat. So I'm from California. So I think about the cycle we see is the flooding, the rapid growth, the grasslands, and then the drought and the wildfires. Have you thought about those?
Yeah, so I have not worked, like, for example, in the California context, but folks have, and there is, for example, a literature on kind of wildfire exposures and the different kind of implications both for health in terms of smoke, but also migration and relocation. But yeah, I think that's a great example, and I think highlights the importance of thinking about these specific contexts, right? So, the global analysis that we showed is, I think has some benefits in terms of describing some of these trends across different regions of the world, but it misses a lot of these dynamics, which I think then highlights the value of taking something like that and then zooming into a specific context and thinking about those dynamics, including the cycles that you're mentioning, and then also those kind of compounding risks, like you said, flooding and heat, like what happens there. And yeah, I mean, we've often I think it's tricky to model in some cases in a way that's interpretable. So I think in all of these models, there's a tension between accounting for the very complex nature of some of these environmental dynamics and then needing something that is interpretable and something you can communicate. And there's a tension between there. And then the other kind of issue that I think we're all thinking about is that there are many different risks and many different ways to model all of those. And I think in my view, we try to avoid a kind of completely data-driven approach. So for each of these studies, we usually try to set out before we do any analysis, kind of a sequence of models and a sequence of measures that we think are, conceptually and empirically justified and go through those rather than test every single combination. But one of those, this is a long way of getting to saying that one of those is usually to think about, for example, the interaction between temperature and precipitation to see if, those combinations, for example, of heat and excessive precipitation or heat and flooding, right, have different effects than just one or the other. And it's something that we've detected in some cases, but and the global model is surprisingly not something we see too much, but it may be because it's really in only certain locations where those kind of dynamics are happening. But yeah, thanks for that point.
Please, go ahead.
Yeah.
You mentioned it better like GG outcomes. I was wondering so if we get qualitative maybe better thing.
Yeah, the answer is absolutely. Yeah, I think we need more qualitative research in this to understand mechanisms, to understand also perceptions, right? In terms of the broader field of kind of population environment research that I mentioned. Back 10 or 15 years ago, there was a lot of use of like self-reported exposure to shocks, for example. Did you experience a drought? Yes or no? And as these geocoded and climate data sets and environmental data sets became more available, more easily accessible given changes in computing power, I think a lot of us said, oh, well, like, let's use the objective measures, right? Because they're objective and they're not subject to some of those self-reporting biases that we might be worried about. But then, recently, I think myself and many others, I think in this field are starting to think, well, there's actually a lot of reason to go back to thinking about perceptions, or at least think about those perceptions in dialogue with the so-called objective measures that we have. Because ultimately it's the perceptions that shape behavior, and at least with respect to some of these mechanisms. And so it would be really important to make sure, for example, that if we're thinking, based on our Earth observation data, that there's a flood or that there's a heat wave, are people actually experiencing that? And that, that's a really important data point. But that's just one of many examples where I think that could be very useful. Yeah.
Right, online?
Yeah. Kimberly, online.
Hi, thank you. This was a great presentation. My question is about whether or not you think that some of the findings you know, elucidated here are applicable to urban heat islands.
Yeah, I think you could potentially see that. We haven't zoomed in to that degree, but there is, pretty extensive, or at least a significant body of work that has looked at measuring those heat islands and looking at heat island effects. So yeah, I think you could certainly see some of that. And that would amplify, any of the kind of warming trends that we're seeing overall. And I think, is a reason to kind of think about urban populations, right? And this is another thing, maybe another kind of counterintuitive finding where I think, for many years there was a major assumption that it was rural populations that would be vulnerable to these shocks. And the assumption was basically, well, rural populations are dependent on agriculture and agriculture is sensitive to climate. So it's going to be rural populations that are really impacted. But, with heat, for example, there's a lot of reasons to think that there's just kind of direct physiological impacts on many of these outcomes. That can also then have second order impacts on kind of urban economies. And so there's a lot of reason to focus on urban populations as well.
One comment, one question, one comment, one question. The comment is, for your first study, I really appreciate the fact that you are thinking about the fact that the PFRH is positively associated with the climate change, whereas mortality is other way. It's more of a compensatory or sort of compensating factor, I guess, so to speak, or connected, right? So I wonder to further look at that, if you can maybe adopt sort of a synthetic cohort approach where you can look at all these three in the same cohort, and over time, you have at least 20, 30 years of data, the composition changes over time. I think that would hopefully help with that, argument of shifting a bit more.
Yeah.
That's one comment. The other, and it's more of a question to the broad questions. I'm curious to understand. I definitely see that the field is getting a lot more nuanced. Much more interesting measurements coming your way. But I guess sort of in the face of AI, is there any particular directions that you think would be super promising to help expedite
with AI? Yeah. So yeah, I guess I'm a little bit of an AI skeptic, but I guess AI is also very broadly defined, right? So, I guess you like logistic regression, maybe I could say that we're using AI. But I do think that there are some like machine learning approaches to thinking about to detect some patterns in environmental conditions and maybe, take a more data-driven approach to measuring anomalies, not in the sense of how I've described them as this like Z-score, but, anomalous conditions, right? And trying to detect some of the changes in patterns in environmental conditions in ways that we can't do, that we can't easily do on our own, right? So like, taking daily or even hourly temperature, precipitation kind of data and seeing some kind of like trying to detect really anomalous periods based on, that finer grained record. I think I could imagine that. Yeah, I think there's maybe some approaches to, again, using kind of machine learning approaches to classifying land cover, or like in the case of flooding, inundation, that maybe go beyond some of the more simplistic approaches that we've taken based on that. That's kind of where I see a lot of potential promises, maybe on the measurement of exposures, where I think we could, as the previous question, indicated, maybe pick up some of those local dynamics in ways that we can't, or would be hard to do on our given our current approaches. But I don't know. Do you have any ideas?
Talking about this, so I actually just looked at some interviews that was done with Jensen Huang and Elon Musk, recently, and they were talking about to be able to actually fully unleash the power, you need to have like solar panels, a lot of them, through in the space to provide the electricity that's needed. So I'm thinking that this is just be crazy, but I think with that level of spatial infrastructure, I would imagine a lot more high resolution measurement would actually become more feasible to have high level resolution measurement. And I think there is a recent NASA development that I can look up and send it to you later. That they're trying to actually zoom into a few different spots on Earth to try to provide better, higher resolution measurements.
Oh yeah.
I think one of them is somewhere in Ethiopia, but I'll look it up and let you know.
Yeah.
So I think that might be a potential sort of infrastructural
Yeah.
change.
Yeah.
All the exposure measurements a lot more.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, I think higher resolution would be great. And then if there's some way that we can think more about, high resolution and exposure is very good, but then we also need to think about the people and tracking their locations. And that's a huge limitation. And maybe there are some advances there in terms of taking data where we're tracking people and then turning that into something that's some type of meaningful composite index or something. Yeah.
Any other online? Okay, if not, maybe we can just wrap up. And if everyone's coming, and happy holidays. Good to see everyone after this. And thanks, Brian, again.